Welcome back. We will be looking at the rest of the financial performance indicators that are project based. We have looked at overall what we can use for evaluating the performance of a company. Now our focus is on exactly what we can do in terms of looking at investments and individual projects. So we will be looking at three key metrics or measures that are very common and things that you already are familiar with: NPV, IRR, and MIRR. Net present value, internal rate of return, and marginal internal rate of return. Okay, so the net present value is fairly simple. It's the final net amount of capital in terms of present value you will gain once an entire project is commissioned. So you look at the entire lifetime of the project. You come up with all the cash flows, relevant cash flows in particular. So you disregard all the relevant sunk costs, committed costs, general overheads, all of that. You only use relevant costs and you calculate the net present value. It's quite an effective tool and metric to use to evaluate. When the NPV is positive, we say that we can accept a project. When it's negative, we say we will be rejecting it. So advantages: it has strong correlation with shareholder value. It considers the time value, of course, because you have to discount it to understand what's going on now because of the inflationary effect. So time value of money is considered, and risk is generally allowed for by adjusting the cost of capital. So since you're bringing in your cost of capital, which is the culmination of your debt capital cost and cost of debt and cost of equity, you are in a better position to incorporate the risk and to really see how well the projects are actually working. Disadvantages, some may find it, not you, of course, not students of finance, but general those of them who are not familiar with this content may find it difficult. It does not easily allow two projects of very different sizes to be compared. So because it's absolute terms, NPV is in dollar terms, comparison is a little challenging, and it is based on a number of assumptions about cash flows. One of the fundamental ones being on WACC, the weighted average cost of capital. So that in itself, it's based on Modigliani Miller. So there are a number of assumptions that can be challenged. So even the time value consideration also, you may be using 10% or 5% or whatever your cost of capital is, but to what extent is that number actual? Is that number correct? So unless those assumptions hold to be true, that number becomes irrelevant, even though the impact may be marginal. So it has its weaknesses, but it's very common, and it has a lot of improvements like adjusted present value that can be calculated in a more advanced sense. Furthermore, on a positive side, cash flows are generally less subject to manipulation. So you're using the relevant cash flows, which makes the figure very good. Considers all the project cash flows and a superior measure to IRR, especially for mutually exclusive projects where you have to consider whether I have to do this or that, where you are individually looking at them. When the projects are exclusive and you cannot undertake multiple projects, this becomes an effective tool to use. And another thing is, it's a little funny. It's that most organizations, when they're at the beginning, before they start the project, when they're evaluating projects, they use NPV. NPV is their go-to measure. If NPV is positive, only they will accept. But once they accept a positive NPV project, they start measuring performance and assigning targets based on profitability measures. GP margin, operating margin, all of that. So you see the inconsistency, right? If you undertook it as NPV, then you should try to track it at least in some form of value-based KPI. But instead, you switch to profit, and then suddenly it seems like this impossible project, and the target seems so high. So that disconnect is there. That is a challenge. I would implore upon you, if you ever become to go on, senior managers, to take that into account whenever you are evaluating performances of employees that are working under you. Another component of NPV is the factor sensitivity. Sensitivity when can be calculated. Generally, for NPV, there are so many factors that are influenced. So what sensitivity does is it helps us isolate each factor and see what exactly is the sensitivity. So we could calculate the sensitivity of revenue, And if the sensitivity is something like, let's say 20%, what it means that if revenue changes by 20%, or in revenue's case, if revenue falls by 20%, then the NPV will become zero, or it will, change sides. It will become zero, or it will become negative. Let me rephrase it. Let's say there's a project where the NPV is positive at a cost of capital of 10%. So you've calculated the whole thing. NPV is positive. It's positive 200,000 or whatever. So now you want to calculate the sensitivity of this NPV figure of this positive 200,000 to the factor called revenue, right? Top line revenue, sales. So you use this formula. Basically, you divide the total NPV from the present value of the sales values alone, just the sales revenue values. You take the present value, divide it, multiply by 100, you'll get a figure. And that figure may be like 120% or something like that. So if that is the case, let's say the sensitivity is 20%, that means that your NPV is sensitive to revenue by 20%. Essentially meaning that if revenue falls by 20%, your NPV will become negative. So you know by that you cannot let your revenue fall 20%. You know that if that happens, your NPV is becoming zero. So what you will always try to do is you will have to keep a safety margin of at least 5% or 10%, ensuring that revenue doesn't fall beyond that. That is essentially how sensitivity gets used. So you can try it out with a calculation. However, um, what I want to remind you is, so this calculation is an entire good sum with the answer also. But look at this. This question is included as a recap of NPV. Just it's from I think F9. But in APM or F9 or F5. But it is unlikely in an APM question that you will be asked to prepare detailed calculations similar to those shown in requirements A and B, because it's actually not relevant. For you, it's about evaluating. It's about saying, are they doing this right? What are they doing wrong? That sort of thing. It's essay format. You don't get to do the calculations here. So with that, understand, it's the same with IRR and MIRR. So let me quickly run through IRR and MIRR. So IRR and MIRR both are percentage based. You use the NPV figures. IRR is a method of using the interpolation technique. There are a couple of additional videos that you will notice in your Google Drive, which I discuss the calculations, right? So you can use those if you want, in order to get a full view of how those numbers work. I think there is a YouTube video as well. So if you want, you can follow that whole thing. But again, as I said, the calculations are just as a recap. You're not being tested on the calculations. So what IRR does is it tells us the maximum percentage rate of return. We know that if IRR is above the cost of capital, we know that the project can be accepted, right? Generally. And if the IRR is less than the firm's cost of capital, then we know this. If the project's IRR is less than the cost of capital, then not good. So generally, it is a method that you can use to compare different projects, even if the project sizes are different, because the result is a percentage figure. So you can actually compare them. So if you want to try out the sums, I would suggest you to try out the examples. Just calculate the IRR and also watch my other videos that I have assigned if you want to recap the numbers. Similar with MIRR. MIRR is so one of the weaknesses of IRR, because it uses this mathematical model called interpolation, is that sometimes you get a curve. Right? You have the x-axis, you have the y-axis, and the IRR curve goes through the x-axis like this. There are 2 points, 2 IRRs. Now, nobody knows exactly what happened. I mean, you can mathematically explain it, but it can be very complicated. So MIRR is this concept that deals with that possibility, that makes sure that possibility doesn't happen, that you will only get one internal rate of return. We call that the marginal internal rate of return. The MIRR assumes, so what it does to address that issue is that it assumes that the project's returns are reinvested at the cost of capital. So whatever you keep making returns, right? When you calculate the NPV, every year you'll be gaining some returns. What it does is in the MIR calculation, those excess returns are not kept with you. Those are further reinvested at the firm's or the project's cost of capital. So you keep bringing it in terms of NPV or present values into the calculation. That's exactly what happens with the MIRR. Same with IRR. If the MIRR is greater than the cost of capital, you accept it, because then if the MIRR is greater than your cost of capital, it means you're making more, right? So the steps and an example has been provided for you. You can try it out. And I have done the workings, and I have done the discussion in the YouTube video. So the link will be attached for you. You can try it out there if you want to, if you're interested. There's a longer way of doing it, step one method, and a shorter way. There's a simple formula that is used, as you can see here: PV of inflows divided by PV of outflows to the power root of the project time period, number of years, into 1 plus R, close brackets, minus 1. That whole answer minus 1. Okay. Assessing performance and giving performance management advice. So this is just to reflect on what your job is. In APM, again, I'm reminding you, no calculations. You're not expected to do that. That's all looked at in calculations. If AFM, if you're taking up AFM from the electives, that's where you find this. In fact, in AFM, it goes way beyond this. NPV, IRR goes way beyond this. With NPV, we even go further to look at things like adjusted present value. So here, the examining team will expect you to be able to assess and comment on the financial performance of an organization using a range of appropriate measures. So in the APM exam, it is more important that you give performance management advice rather than just being able to calculate a long list of ratios. So you don't get to calculate ratios. In fact, what happens is that as far as ratio calculations are concerned, what will happen is you might get to evaluate. You might get to evaluate any workings they've done and say, look, they've made a mistake here, or they shouldn't have used it. If they've calculated ROC, and let's say someone has used EBITDA instead of operating profit, right? And then that has inflated the figures. Then it is your job, if that is the question, they say evaluate the ratios, then it is your job to look at that and say, I see a discrepancy here, and the correct figure should have been used is this figure. So that is the sort of work you have to do. Keep that in mind, please. Don't get too too lost in the calculations of the numbers. So on that note, we complete this segment of looking at all the blanket ratios and the metrics of looking at an overall company and the project itself. We will be moving on to the final segment of this chapter in the next video. Thank you and good luck.